So the first thing I wanted to introduce to you is a tool that we will use to become more analytical in Unit 9, and then when we start reviewing Units 1 through 6, to also become more analytical in Units 1 through 6. So obviously AP World History is all about changes and connections and understanding and explaining complex events. So one tool that we can use to kind of understand and explain events in AP World History is the Interests, Institutions, and Ideas tool. It's a tool that I borrowed from one of the excerpts from an OpenEL course that you're assigned. So basically, this tool allows us to explain events in AP World History and better understand them. So interests kind of help drive the world. And what do I mean by interests? By interests, usually, people refer to material interests like security, economic well-being, etc. So states and countries can have interests, and this can affect the interactions between one state and another state. This can affect and be a cause of certain events in history. And also individual people can have interests. Usually this plays out within domestic politics, but also it can actually play out at the international level as well, which is predominantly what we're concerned about as AP World History scholars. Institutions also have a huge role in AP World History. In domestic politics, institutions can be things such as courts or the separation of powers. In the international environment today, institutions like the United Nations, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the International Monetary Fund play huge roles in how the world works today. Ideas also have a huge role in AP World History. So ideas can be stuff like ideologies. We went through a lot of isms in this class: fascism, communism, Marxism, capitalism. Cultures, norms, and other things can have a huge impact on world events and obviously have a huge impact today. So obviously this tool can help focus your thinking around why things happen and comprehending things in AP World History and events in AP World History. But these three concepts can be interrelated. For example, one prominent multinational corporation, Google, exercises a lot of power and has the ability to change the way the world works today. Google has its unique set of interests, right? It's profit making, maybe, is what drives Google. It's an institution. Google is an institution. In the days of imperialism, joint stock companies are institutions with the profit motivating interests. And maybe what helps facilitate those institutions' ability to have an impact on world history is ideas about the relationship between Europeans and non-Europeans. Maybe this idea that Europeans are more sophisticated and more deserving to have their interests actualized through brute force, because joint stock companies were much more brutal than Google is today in getting its profits. Another tool that I wanted to give you was Galtung's Typology of Violence. So basically thinking about violence in different ways. So direct violence is easy enough to explain. It's stuff that we've seen in AP World History, invasions. On the individual level, it's punches, it's assault. Structural and cultural violence are more interesting types of violence. So direct violence represents behaviors that serve to threaten life itself and or to diminish one's capacity to meet basic human needs. So The image of direct violence in this slide is in the top rightmost corner. It's a picture of a Syrian rebel in a sniper's nest. Structural violence represents the systematic ways in which some groups are hindered from equal access to opportunities, goods, and services that enable the fulfillment of basic human needs. So the image of this one is in the left-hand side. It's the system of segregation, racial segregation, that was enacted in the United States. Jim Crow laws were a legal system. It was legally mandated that blacks and whites be separated, and blacks were often given lesser goods and services. They also don't have to necessarily be a legal system or a legal structure. It can be something like lack of access to education, lack of internet access, which we at IDS MD now realize has had a profound effect on the education of our teens in these in this trying time. Cultural violence is what basically makes direct violence and structural violence possible, what makes it seem normal or even right. For example, cultural violence in the age of imperialism would take the form of ideas about the inferiority of Africans or non-Europeans, their diminished status in the eyes of Europeans, the need to civilize them. La mission civilisatrice gives justification to European imperialism and violences against people all across the Third World. So the last thing I wanted to talk about before I get into the Unit 9 review was regimes. So a regime refers to the kind of governing system that runs a state. So states in today's world include France, the United States, and China. But a regime is the type of governing system. So the United States has a constitutional republic. The PRC, the People's Republic of China, has actually an authoritarian regime. So it's a misnomer. And Iran's regime is a Shia theocracy. The reason why I wanted to go over regimes is to tell you that there's really kind of a spectrum. There's a lot of regimes in today's world and in AP world history that claim to be democratic. You'll notice China even has republic in its official title, but really aren't. They're really just authoritarian regimes. Authoritarian regimes broadly favor the concentration of power in a leader or an elite, not constitutionally responsible to the people. That's just one definition. Totalitarian regimes are a type of authoritarian regime where the focus is on the subordination of the individual to the state and strict control over all aspects of life. Think North Korea today. An autocracy, again, is a type of authoritarian regime that focuses on the concentration of power in especially one person or a dictator. So regimes are kind of really a spectrum, right? So on the leftmost side, authoritarian regimes, they're really nasty. There's all kinds of repression. On the rightmost side are nice regimes, and they're more democratic. There's more freedom and pluralism. You'll notice on this picture I included a democratic threshold and then a consolidation threshold. So this is just basically to suggest that, you know, at some point an authoritarian regime can be considered democratic. The consolidation threshold indicates that that democratic regime is actually pretty strong. Consolidate means to strengthen and to enforce. So that democratic regime is strong and it's likely to stay democratic, and it has the most freedom, the most pluralism. There's really a lot of imperfect democracies in the world. And then there's a lot of authoritarian regimes that want to pretend to be democracies, but really aren't. So, for example, Russia, um, Vladimir Putin still calls himself president. He's not a president, he's an autocrat, he's a dictator, but he still does it. So this is a list of types of authoritarian regimes, and you'll notice on the extreme left end is totalitarianism. There's all kinds of funny looking names, so I wouldn't be too focused on it. I would just be able to distinguish between an authoritarian and democratic regime. That's your objective for right now. So I just wanted to show you that there's all kinds of funny names that political scientists give to particular regimes as they try to classify them. And even political scientists sometimes classify them in different ways because, to be honest, it's really hard to classify regimes. Here's a list of some common types of democracies. States can progress. They can go from authoritarian to more democratic, and you can see the case of Spain, it going from more authoritarian to more democratic. Process by any means doesn't have to be linear. You can see that Germany does a lot of jumping around in this image. On to Unit 9. So the first section of your packet covers democracy and authoritarianism in Russia. And so Russia really is a case study of the initial hope with the end of the Cold War and then the pessimism and disappointment as the years progressed. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, there really was an assumption that democratic capitalism would prevail as the world's most prominent ideology and system of government in the international system. Russia became a democracy, but they suffered huge economic collapse in the transition as the communist state tried to transition to a capitalist system. The communist state owned all the resources, so transitioning to a capitalist system meant that they had to sell all of the factories and means of production to private owners. The only people that were able to afford that were a corrupt Russian elite called the oligarchs. And ever since then, Russia's been a very corrupt economic system. Moreover, Vladimir Putin comes to power in 1999. He has pretty much held power in Russia ever since. Although he is the president of Russia, he's an autocrat, he's a dictator. He's consolidated his power by relying on the support of the Russian oligarchs and by terrorizing his opposition groups, harassing his opposition groups. Russia very quickly became an authoritarian and highly militaristic society. The next section you have in your Unit 9 review packet discuss NATO expansion, the European Union, and the Washington Consensus. NATO was an institution and a system of alliances that aimed to contain the Soviet Union. Of course, with the end of the Cold War, the reason of being for NATO basically changes. And so the institution searches for purpose, so to speak. A lot of people thought that NATO would just dissolve, it would go away. But NATO in the 1990s begins expanding and into the 2000s. It integrates countries in Eastern Europe. Some people say that this integration has hurt the relationship between Russia and the West. From the Russian point of view, NATO expansion looks threatening. And I guess everyone can kind of understand that logic. The EU also expands during this time period. It creates a free trade zone and a single currency union in Europe. The EU is not a system of alliances like NATO. It is more an economic institution. One of its political purposes is to basically integrate the economies of Europe to ensure that there's no other world war, especially against France and Germany. This section also talks a lot about the Washington Consensus, which is a consensus or an agreement reached in Washington, D.C. in the 1990s. So after the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, international institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which are heavily funded by the United States, come to an agreement on basic principles that will help countries develop their economies. The Washington Consensus is a type of thinking, right? It's a thinking that there is the best model for economic development, and it involves privatization, deregulation, and markets. For a full picture on that, please look into the description and your review packets for a Harvard X video on neoliberalism. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, then in the 1990s, really into the 2000s, then starts offering aid to developing countries, so countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, but they're conditional. The condition is that these governments have to implement their principles in their policies. A lot of people criticize this because, for various reasons, these policies led to a variety of economic shocks and crises, and the rollout really kind of left people disillusioned. And a lot of people said that it was just a new form of imperialism. There was a lot of criticism against the Washington Consensus. The two political cartoons on the right kind of suggest why. The next section in your review packet talks about capitalist economics with communist politics. So in the Cold War, we talked about how democratic capitalism faced off against authoritarian communism. Both those terms, in blue, you can see a description of a political system, and in red, you can see a description of an economic system. After the fall of the Soviet Union, it was assumed, like I said earlier, that democratic capitalism would sweep across the globe. Some scholars even called it the end of history. China, however, seems to pretty heavily dismiss this belief. A lot of people assume that democratic capitalism and authoritarian communism went hand in hand. Of course, this is kind of ideology blinding people. We saw examples of authoritarian states aligned with the United States that were more capitalistic than communistic, I guess, in the Cold War. Remember, capitalism means the means of production are primarily in private hands, and communism is an economic system where the means of production are held in common, and usually by the state. So China successfully implements capitalist policies in its economy in the 1980s under Deng Xiaoping. But Deng Xiaoping is very clear. This does not mean a reformation of the political system. Nonetheless, pro-democracy advocates start making demands on the Chinese political system to also reform, to allow for greater democratic accountability, more freedom. There are the Tiananmen Square protesters that famously in 1989 were, several of them were actually massacred by the communist government, the Chinese government. A lot of people assumed that the Chinese government would reform itself when it was met by millions of protesters at one point in Tiananmen Square, which is a important site in China. They did not. They decided to open fire on the protesters in one night called the Tiananmen Square Massacre. and really kind of doubled down on their political system. Um, the message was pretty clear. The government would remain authoritarian. On the right, you can see a famous image of Tank Man. So the tanks that were involved actually in clearing out the protesters from Tiananmen Square were parading through the streets shortly after. And this man, it appears that he was just grocery shopping, stands in front of the tank, and has since become a symbol for protesting against authoritarian rule, for disobedience, against injustice, etc. The tank does not run him over. Um, you can watch the full video below on him standing in front of the tank in the description. In the left, I included a book by Matthew Koenig, who's a professor at Georgetown University. Um, his book is titled "The Return of Great Power Rivalry." It talks about how the United States, China, and even Russia have now entered a new era of great power competition. So very much the end of history is behind them. China grew exponentially after it implemented capitalist economics in the 1980s, and has become an economic powerhouse in the world today. Some people say that China will eventually overtake the United States as the world's most powerful country. You have another section on apartheid and the end of apartheid in South Africa, the rise of Nelson Mandela in your packet. So in the right-hand corner, you can see a brutal massacre by the South African white security forces against black Africans. In the left is a scene from District 9, which tries to is an allegory for apartheid in South Africa. And it's a sci-fi movie. It's really good. You can see your analysis on it is actually included in the packet. So go check them out. We've talked about the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts and the Arab-Israeli conflicts a lot, I think 4 times in this course already now. So go ahead and rewatch the Vox video. There's 2 wars in the 21st century. It's still one of those conflicts that is ongoing, and it seems almost unsolvable. So please stay up to date on that. There is also a section on Iran, and particularly Iran's relationship with the United States in your Unit 9 review packet. We discussed how the United States in the Cold War overthrew the democratically elected government in 1953 and installed a brutal dictator, the Shah of Iran. This caused blowback in 1979. The Shah of Iran is overthrown, and Ayatollah Khomeini returns to power. In the top left-hand side, you can see American embassy workers blindfolded as they're taken hostage after Iranian protesters storm the American embassy. Ayatollah Khomeini installs a Shia theocracy. In CCR, we read Persepolis in the top right-hand corner. And Iranian and the American relationship has been strained ever since. To describe it lightly, Iran claims to be in pursuit of nuclear technology, passive nuclear technology, not for a nuclear weapon, but the United States thinks that it's just a disguise to pursue a nuclear weapon, which it probably is. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad evaluating centrifuges, valuable nuclear technology. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, the latest flashpoint between Iranian and U.S. Relationship was the assassination of Soleimani, a top Iranian Quds Forces general, by President Trump. As recently as this week, actually, I think the United States chose to put added sanctions on Iran as Iran deals with the coronavirus. They're actually one of the hardest hit countries. Another thing that starts in the 1990s is attempts to kind of revive so to speak, international law. So the international institution called the International Criminal Court comes into being. It's an international institution with the goal of holding individuals responsible for crimes against humanity. A lot of states take issue with this. They claim that it violates their sovereignty or freedom from external control. The United States is one of the big states that takes issue with the International Criminal Court, and you'll see that in your videos assigned in your packet. There are a lot of proponents at the same time that are pushing for the norm of R2P, the responsibility to protect. So a lot of high-level UN officials, like Kofi Annan is the General Secretary, which is the highest position in the United Nations, advocate for this norm. You can see Annan pretty clearly states that although the international system is based on sovereignty, the sovereignty of states must no longer be used as a shield for gross violations of human rights. So basically, Annan is giving credence to the idea that countries can basically intervene in other countries if they're protecting the rights of individuals. He makes the point to say that the United Nations Charter was written in the name of people, not in states. You can see here that R2P is an idea and ICC is an institution. So both this, the tool that we introduced at the beginning of class, that ideas and institutions can have a profound effect on international politics and AP World History, it's incredibly relevant here. People think R2P sounds too good, and countries are just going to invoke it and claim that they're intervening for humanitarian reasons, meaning the promotion of human welfare, when they're not actually. They're just lying. You can see here a pair of political cartoons suggesting that governments around the world have helped undermine the International Criminal Court. As some governments have agreed to it, others have not. One big critic of the ICC is John Bolton, who was the former National Security Advisor of President Trump and worked in the Bush administration. Bill Clinton actually criticized the ICC as well. So almost bipartisan criticism of the ICC as unnecessarily eroding state sovereignty. So you can see the political cartoon on the right. In your packet, you'll have videos, and hopefully they add context to this debate. The takeaway should be that states like sovereignty. They like the freedom from external control. I guess the debate about R2P gets at this idea, is there such a thing as a humanitarian intervention? If states pursue interests when they intervene in other countries, does that automatically disqualify it as a humanitarian intervention? What's the metric or judge for success? And why do humanitarian interventions, at least a lot of the times, take the form of military interventions? So the debate about humanitarian intervention is obviously still ongoing. You can watch Noam Chomsky, who's a public intellectual, a linguistics professor at MIT, speak at Williams College in the description. And he kind of likens humanitarian intervention as basically a new form of imperialism. Almost, it gets back at the tool that I gave you at the beginning, almost like cultural violence, right? It justifies violence, whether it come in the form of direct violence or structural violence. R2P was not invoked in 1994 when this picture is taken, and this is one of my favorite pictures. I think a good picture really has to tell a story, and this picture does tell a story. So that man right there, he's an American Marine, and he's protecting a man you can see on the ground there. And he has one hand outstretched with a gun and one hand outstretched with a hand. So this is the 1994 alleged humanitarian intervention in Haiti, orchestrated by the United States. Explaining what led up to this is super complicated, so I'm just going to give you the gist of it. A democratically elected president of Haiti was ousted by a military coup, and that had a band of authoritarian thugs that would go around terrorizing people. The United States intervened, obviously militarily, and they reinstalled the president. It was largely bloodless. Because the United States facilitated the reconciliation of the country. They gave amnesty to people that had committed crimes. That man on the ground was accused by the crowd, and he was actually going to be beaten to death, of throwing a grenade into a pro-democracy rally. Humanitarian intervention seems simple, the logic seems simple, but it's a complex world, and so a lot of people criticize this intervention because it really didn't make Haiti better off. Later on, the United States invades Haiti again in 2004, I believe, to reinstall the same president that is actually ousted again. Also, there's arguments that the president just wasn't very good. His policies weren't great. His economic agenda, in particular, was thwarted by the United States and the International Monetary Fund and World Bank that gave him loans on the condition that he implement the economic policies that we discussed earlier. There are much more controversial humanitarian interventions than this one. I just think the picture speaks so much, and I just really would hope you would take a long time to look at it and kind of think, what do I mean by the picture speaks so much? One of the other things that we talk about in this unit is international terrorism and the wars on terrorism, and actually the Bush Doctrine. Both have really defined the 21st century for better or for worse, and you'll see what I mean for worse as well. So please take a look at all the videos on that. 9/11 was a horrific day, and it really has shaped U.S. foreign policy and intervention overseas and shaped the world we live in today. We've been at war in Afghanistan, for example, since before you guys were born. So globalization really becomes a big topic that is talked a lot about in Unit 9, and I think we all have kind of an idea of what globalization is. Here's the economic definition, and then broadly it describes like this exchange of cultures and ideas, and basically the world coming closer together. I would say that there are examples in world history of the world becoming closer together, worlds together, and then the worlds coming apart. There's benefits to globalization, and there are also consequences of globalization. Consequences you see today. Increasing interconnectivity allowed the coronavirus, for example, to spread. Here's another example of the Ebola epidemic, which was not a pandemic, but could have very well have been a pandemic. There was fears that it would spread across the world, and it did spread to a lot of places, but we were able to contain the virus that time in 2015, and unsuccessful this time. You can see this is just a picture that tells a story. I really, really appreciate these pictures. Go to the Pulitzer Prize website once in a while. You'll see some really fantastic pictures. I think all of us are familiar with climate change and how it has fundamentally transforming the world and has the potential to continue to do so, and responses to that. Just some vocabulary. The definitions may have already come, but humanitarian intervention, collective action problem. Go look at the video on Is Game of Thrones a collective action story by Vox in the description. Legitimacy, we've gone over that one again. Terrorism is a tactic used by the weak against the strong. Those are all the descriptions. Ideology, etc. So you can see that in the video.